Welcome to the Draft Board, where hosts David Song and Tyson Workington tackle the topics that you want to hear. From the rink to the turf to the court, anything and everything. This is the Draft Board.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Draft Board. Once again, we hope that you guys have been having a great month, and we're excited to be back with you after another hiatus here. Tyson, how you been doing lately?
Been doing good. It's nice to have the sunshine out, be able to get some warm weather. Unfortunately, it's been raining for the last few days, but you know what? I'm doing pretty well. It's doing pretty good.
And certainly the playoffs in both the NBA and NHL have been heavily on our minds and our schedules. I'll say that right now.
Absolutely.
Last Saturday, I watched 3 NHL playoff games in one day. We had Lightning Panthers, Islanders Penguins, and Leafs Habs, and I watched every single one of those games. And after that day, I thought to myself, you know, maybe sports journalism is a good fit for me.
I think it is.
Well, before we get started, though, with today's episode, which, of course, as you folks can imagine, a lot of playoff talk out of both the world of hockey and the world of basketball, we want to give a shout-out to a couple of people that have really supported us in smaller ways, but nonetheless very, very significant ways, I think, specifically for us as a young podcast. And one of those is Mr. Graham Besse. Now, if you don't know that name, you will. I'm just kidding. you may or may not, but he's a good guy. This is a guy that I went to junior high school with, and he is the gentleman that is responsible for making the new intro and outro that you will have heard on our last episode. You'll hear on this episode, and you're also going to hear it in every episode until we, get perhaps a more fancy one. But you know, Tyson, the funny story is that Graham and I, we didn't just go to junior high and high school together. Hockey was literally the reason we became friends. And I have a memory of, I was in grade 9 in 2010, and the weeks leading up to the Olympic hockey tournament on home soil, I still remember that Graham and I were in the same junior high drama class, and at one point in time we just started talking, and at that point, because I wasn't a sports guy yet, Jerome McGinley and Sidney Crosby are the only 2 players I've ever heard of, and so I asked him essentially, who else on Team Canada is good? Because I've heard we're Canadians. We have a really good team, right? He told me about Rick Nash. He told me about Chris Pronger and Duncan Keith and Jonathan Taves, who was 20 years old at that point in time. Wow, has it flown by.
Yep.
And essentially, for those of you out there that don't know my story, that hockey tournament and that Olympic Games in general, Vancouver 2010, is what made me into a sports fan, and it changed my life, as we know now, for me sitting here. And for us to have stayed in touch on Facebook, I mean, social media can be a good thing sometimes, and we started texting each other again a few months ago, and I introduced him to my podcast. He really enjoyed it. Shout out to you, Graham. We appreciate your listenership, and he took his own time to make us an intro and an outro, and he did not charge us for it. So we want to thank you very much for that, Graham. We hope you continue to enjoy the content that we're putting out for you, and for everyone else that, for everyone else that tunes in, and thank you so much for your help.
Yeah, it's been really great, and you know, it's always good to have people come alongside us and help us out whenever we can, and yeah, we're grateful for Graham for that.
Someone else I'd like to give a shout out to is my other friend, Kirsten Korsrud, who also took some of her time to create a starter logo for our podcast. We don't have one yet. We are excited to show that off for you on our Instagram account. And again, it's very nice, it's very functional, and we're glad to have our first one. And Kirsten, to be honest, I'm not sure if she's a huge sports fan, but we appreciate the support as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's always good to have that support. So yeah, thank you very much for that, and we'll be looking forward to getting that out on social media.
Now, without further ado, let's go right into the NHL playoffs, which is one of the most fun things in sports. And why don't we start with our feel-good story, Tyson? And this involves a young kid named Spencer Knight. If you're a Canadian and you know him, yes, he broke our hearts in the World Junior Championships gold medal match this year. And like Tyson, we were talking about this before the show. This young man came straight out of college and into the NHL playoffs, somewhat similar to what Cale Makar did a couple of years back. This kid is born April 19th, 2001. And for those of us that straddle the line between millennials and Generation Z if you're American, that blows my mind. Like, you want to tell me Spencer Knight is 20 years old, which he is, right? He's got his whole future ahead of him. But to just say that he was born in 01, it breaks your brain a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting old.
Dude, how old are you again?
I'm 24.
You're 24. I'm 25. We're like halfway to the grave. Anyways, we hope not. But anyways, tell you a little bit about Spencer Knight. He's a goaltender, an American kid born in Connecticut, was drafted 13th overall in the first round by the Florida Panthers, his current team, 2 years ago in 2019. And if you were watching the Tampa Bay Lightning Florida Panthers series, which was arguably the best series of the first round so far, it was lots of goals, lots of truculence, as Brian Burke likes to call it, scrums, fights, tempers flaring, and also just superstars going head to head. It was a great series, but you would have also have realized that Florida had a bit of a carousel going on in net. Sergei Bobrovsky was the gentleman they started with, and a guy that has a lot of raw talent, has been established as an elite goaltender before, but has really run into inconsistencies as of recent in his career. And unfortunately, that bit him once again during this key playoff series. He wasn't able to hold it down, and so for, I believe, games 3 and 4, they went to Chris Driedger, 27-year-old, who, again, this is something else we were talking about before the show. Chris Driedger, former Calgary Hitman. And I remember going to the Scotiabank Saddledome. I think back then the Pengrowth Saddledome. I think it could have been that long ago. I forget how long it's been since it was rebranded as the Scotiabank Saddledome, but that's not important. But I remember going with my parents, with my friends, as a teenager in the early 2010s, mid 2010s, watching the Hitman, and Chris Driedger was this young teenager playing alongside the guys in the Western Hockey League, one of the major junior leagues here in Canada. And now at 27 years old, he has made it to the NHL and become at least someone who could challenge for a starting goaltender position. But as great as that is, he didn't do so well either against the Tampa Bay Lightning. So with the backs against the wall, Florida went to this 20-year-old Spencer Knight, who is a highly touted prospect to begin with, excellent college career, and Spencer Knight proceeded to let in the first NHL playoff shot, that he ever faced. Now, granted, it was a 2-on-1 rush, very, very high difficulty, and certainly it's kind of one of those goals where you're like, if you stop that, it was as much luck as it was skill, because it was a cross-crease pass, kind of a one-time tap-in. Yeah. Right. And I think that if you were a Florida fan on Monday watching that, you would be like, oh, here we go, right? He's only 20 years old. Are we going to get our wheels blown off here? And Spencer Knight stopped the next 36 shots in a row as the Florida Panthers took that game and forced a Game 6. Now, granted, they did lose, and were unfortunately shut out yesterday 4-0. But they took the Game 5 4-1 because Spencer Knight led in the first playoff shot he faced, and then put the force field up. Very impressive stuff.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with what Spencer Knight was able to do. Like, as a goalie, I understand kind of like what's going through Spencer Knight's head. For me personally, as a goalie, I always wanted to get shots early to build my confidence. And like Kelly Rudy also talks about this, like, you always want to have that first save of the game, so that way you can kind of have something to look back to. Like, whenever you let in a goal, you always got to try and forget about the goal and remember all of the saves that you had before that, and try and build off of what you've done and try and forget about the bad things that you're doing. So for Spencer Knight, no doubt, letting in the first goal of the game must have been really difficult for him, especially when it's the playoffs, it's the defending champions, and you're down 3-1 at the time, and it's an elimination game for you. If you don't win, you do go home. And he comes out of that, and he's just absolutely unbeatable for 55 minutes of the game, and he's just incredible. And I'm super impressed of Spencer Knight's not only confidence but also mental toughness and mental ability to kind of put that one goal behind him and focus on the game at hand and play exceptional hockey for the first time he's ever appeared in the playoffs. No doubt it was something special, and it's something he'll always remember.
And just like you said, he stopped a bevy of high difficulty shots after letting in that first one because he was able to remain composed, and his team did an excellent job rallying around him. He stopped 2 Nikita Kucherov one-timers, including one in the final 2 minutes that really would have given Tampa Bay some life. And these are some of the best players in hockey. Nikita Kucherov is freakishly good. He's a part of that current wave of top-tier superstars. And Spencer Knight looked like a 10-year veteran in there on some of those sequences. And even though the Florida Panthers were not able to come back and their season is now over, I agree fully with Brian Boucher from the NBC broadcast that he has gained such valuable experience these last 2 games. And for a kid that has obvious talent, this is going to serve him extremely well going forward.
I think so. And what we saw 2 years ago with Carter Hart having success in the bubble and playing well in the regular season, that's kind of where Spencer Knight is right now. And that, he's a young goalie. He has some good experience. He played in 4 regular season games. He won them all. He had very good numbers. He's put up very good stats so far this year. And yeah, the future looks really bright for Spencer Knight. Now, obviously, the Florida Panthers have Sergei Bobrovsky at $10 million for the next handful of years. So, like you mentioned with Sergei Bobrovsky, he could be, super inconsistent. One year he could be Vezina and could be unbeatable, but then the next year he's very mediocre and, not even, in this series, Sergei Bobrovsky was the 3rd best goalie. And, you mentioned, Chris Drieger, in Game 6, which was the final elimination game, the starter was Spencer Knight, Drieger was the backup, and Bobrovsky, the $10 million goalie, was sitting in the press box because, he wasn't the best option. So I think, Florida has a really good future under Spencer Knight, but unfortunately they gave Bobrovsky this massive contract, so it's something that they're going to have to deal with and look towards. Drieger is a UFA, and there's a whole bunch of rumors that he'll be signing in Seattle, and he'll be getting an opportunity to take the starting job in Seattle after a very good season this year. So we'll look at that in the future, but for Spencer Knight, no doubt, he looks like he could be the future for the Florida Panthers in goal. And the Panthers, they've had some good ones, and Roberto Luongo.
Roberto Luongo was kind of overrated. Right? No, I'm just kidding. Roberto Luongo is a fantastic goaltender, a very funny personality. The game will miss him in net, and fortunately we have young talents like Knight that are coming in and taking over. An interesting piece of trivia that I heard on the NBC broadcast yesterday, or rather this morning, because I watched it this morning when the Tampa Bay Lightning clinched. The Florida Panthers are the first team in NHL history to start 3 separate goalies at least twice over the course of a singular playoff series. Bobrovsky twice, Drieger twice, Spencer Knight twice. That has never happened before.
Wow, that's crazy. I didn't know that. I guess that shows you, I understand Joel Quenneville. He's a very, he's cutthroat a little bit. He likes things the way that he likes things, and he's very demanding of his players. And, we saw that in Chicago when he won 3 cups. So if Quenneville thinks that, Bobrovsky is going to give him the best chance to win games, then they're going to go with him. But he has absolutely no problem, switching goalies out and trying and seeing what works. I think that's really interesting that that's never happened before, but I guess it makes sense because usually teams, they usually go into a series with like a number one goalie or kind of a tandem where they can kind of pick between two guys. So yeah, that's incredible. It shows you the depth of Florida's goaltending, but also it kind of shows you maybe a little bit of the inconsistency that it has.
Right, and if you're a hockey fan, you know that goaltending can steal a playoff series any given year. Now, for those of you out there who don't watch as much hockey, you might think to yourself, how can one man be so important that he can essentially make up for the deficiencies of the five in front of him? And as a goalie, Tyson, I want to ask you about your thoughts on that later on, but I just want to bring up a stat from the Florida-Tampa series that illustrates just how it illustrates just how important goaltending can be. So this was game number 4 of this particular series on May the 22nd, and Florida outshot Tampa Bay 41-26, and Tampa Bay won 6-2.
Wow.
6-2. It makes no sense whatsoever, but when you look at what happened in net, you see that Sergei Bobrovsky gave up 5 goals on 14 shots. That's 64% just about. Drieger came in and only let in 1 on 12, but the damage had already been done at that point. Andrei Vasilevsky stopped 39 of 41. That's, first of all, Vasilevsky is an elite goaltender, and the Tampa Bay Lightning know what they have in him. But Tyson, as someone who's played this position yourself, can you talk a little bit more about how goaltending not only is important, but how these sorts of things can really decide the outcome of a series?
Yeah, so goaltending is super important in like one-to-one games. Like over the course of the season, you can kind of play it a little bit like baseball with averages. Like if you have a goalie that only gives up 2.5 goals a game, sometimes it's going to be 2, sometimes it's going to be 3, sometimes it's going to be 1, sometimes it's going to be 4. You can kind of expect based off of how your team is going to play that you can kind of decide, okay, we need to score, about this many goals in order to win most of our games. But in a short playoff series, if a goalie goes on a hot stretch and gets like super confident, can start playing really well, it's almost impossible for him to get beat. Like there have been times where I've been in playoff situations and I've been, playing really well. I felt really confident, super good going into the games, and I shut the door. And there were some saves that even I was like, wow, I can't believe I made those saves. And the other team was like, well, what do? We can't beat this guy. He's too good. And we go on and we win games even though we necessarily probably shouldn't have won those games. And there's a story that I had, for example, where I was in midget hockey, and it was my second last game that I ever played in minor hockey, and we had it was a 6:30 in the morning game, and we had 8 guys in the dressing room before the game, and myself. And unfortunately, we had 3 guys from the local native reserve, and they had a prior commitment with another team, with their native team, so they were able to play half the game, but they had to leave because they had another prior.
Was Ethan Bear one of them? I'm just kidding.
No, he was not. But they had to leave prior to the game, so we lost 3 players. So all of a sudden now we had 9 players and myself. So we went from 9 players down to 6, and then we had another guy on our team. He had started work that same day. It was his first time. He needed to go to work. He needed to get a job. So we had, for the final 11 minutes of the game, we had 5 players and nobody else.
Oh, wow.
And it was me and 5 guys, and the bench was empty. And it was just to show you how funny it was just in the situation. There was a time where we actually got the puck, and we actually were able to draw the penalty. And I was like, oh, cool, I can go to the bench, we can get an extra attacker, we can go 6-on-5. I skated halfway to the bench, and then I realized that there was nobody on the bench to come off for me.
Oh. Ouch.
Right? And I skated halfway there, and I was like, oh, wait, we can't even go. So skated slowly back to my to my net, and I could hear all the parents in the crowd laughing because it was just funny. And I made 45 saves that day, and we won 3-2.
Congratulations.
So just like to show you, like that was a situation where I was on my game, I was feeling confident, and no matter what the circumstances were, we had 5 players, they had 20. They weren't getting past me. We were winning the game.
And that certainly was the attitude that Andrei Vasilevsky appeared to take with his Lightning teammates. Even though it was a very high-scoring series at times, he still was able to buckle down and shut the door when necessary. And I do think that looking back on this series, goaltending was the primary difference, because at times Florida was able to run and gun with the Tampa Bay Lightning. They have their own superstars like Alexander Barkov, Jonathan Huberdeau. Their blue line played very well in the absence of their top defenseman, Aaron Ekblad.
Sam Bennett also played quite well.
Yes, he did, and we're not going to talk about that too much because, as a Flames fan, you hate to kind of realize that your coaching staff probably mismanaged him and a number of other young players over the course of the last few years. But yes, I'm not ready to call him a superstar just yet, but he was an excellent second liner. And essentially, what I'm trying to say, Florida had the firepower, and their defense was at times up to the task of containing this Lightning offense. But it's because they had such a carousel in net, and Tampa Bay knew that they had one rock in net that they could count on every night, that ended up being the difference. So that puts a bow on a very, very entertaining series. And you know what? For many years, the Florida Panthers especially, and even the Tampa Bay Lightning, I think to a lesser extent, have been underappreciated by their markets despite being very solid teams. And we really hope that the Battle of Florida is going to continue, and that it is going to be something that can draw in fans to this corner of the NHL. Like Alexander Barkov and Jonathan Huberdeau have the talent to be appreciated the way that Crosby and McDavid and Draisaitl and Kucherov are. They're just less famous because they play in Florida, but hopefully this series has cast some light on them now. But having said that, there's a second playoff series we can talk about to show you the importance of goaltending, and that, of course, was the New York Islanders versus the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, Tyson, if I were to tell you that the Pittsburgh Penguins starting goaltender Tristan Jarry allowed 3 or more goals in 5 of the 6 games in this series, does that sound like a winning formula to you?
No. No, it
that
does
is
not.
the right answer.
No, yeah, when you allow 3 or more goals, it means that your team has to score more. Like, I remember when I was a young kid, my dad said to me, you as the goalie get to determine how many goals that your forwards have to score to win, right? Because if you let in 4, then if you need to win, then your forwards got to score 5, right? So if you're letting in 3-4 goals a game, then that means your forwards need to have, good games, and they need to play well. So that's kind of how I see it, is like in the playoffs, is you need to, as a goalie, you need to try and make life easier on your forwards by giving them as many opportunities they have if they run into a really good goalie to kind of keep that game low scoring as much as you can.
And certainly Tristan Jarry was unable to do that this year. He let in, I think, at least 10, if not 11 or 12 goals, high glove in particular.
Oh.
Yes, the vast majority of the goals scored on him over the course of this series were high glove. And because I watched 3 games in that series, Islanders forwards were shooting there with regularity, almost every chance that they got, unless it was an attempted backdoor play or something else set. But off the rush, high glove was more often than not their go-to choice, and that was a smart play on their part because Jarry did not have a good glove hand this series. He was very badly exposed for it, and in that final game of the series yesterday, you said it, I think, best. If Tristan Jarry was average to good, the Penguins pull that out probably 3-2.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, they lost the game 5-3 and they lost the series 4-2 because over the span of about 3 minutes, Tristan Jarry let in 3 rapid-fire goals, and that really was the end of it.
That really was. And, like, I understand kind of watching the replay. Like, the fifth one for sure was bad. The third one I didn't like as well, kind of watching and analyzing the goal as well. But,
well, I mean, I guess just to point it out, I guess what the goals are, we probably should mention. I believe the first one was a cross-crease one-time tap-in for Brock Nelson. That's one of those. That's very similar to the one that Spencer Knight let in. That one is one of those, like we said before, it's as much luck as skill to stop that. The second and third one, folks, we're going to spell this out for you so you can appreciate what we're talking about. The second one was a one-time slap shot from the blue line off a face-off by Ryan Pulock and there was a screen in front and it just beat Tristan Jarry clean. Granted, Ryan Pulock has a howitzer, but still arguably a shot that you need to save. The third one was particularly bad because Brock Nelson simply drove down the ice. Anthony Beauvillier backed off the defense with his speed, and Brock Nelson forced a wrist shot through the 5-hole from 25 feet or so. Those are the 3 goals we're talking about. And you're saying the Pulock one-timer and Nelson's wrist shot in particular, those are goals that Jarry's got to have in the playoffs.
Yeah, like, you don't need all of them, but you need at least 2 of them. Like, at some point, you kind of need to expect a save. Like, what the Leafs struggled with for years is they had a goalie who could make all of the expected saves, but they don't have a goalie that could make the unexpected saves. Like
a Vasilevsky can.
Right. So, like, sometimes in a playoff series especially, you need a goalie to bail you out and make a save that they normally wouldn't make. They need to be able to rise to that occasion and play beyond what they're normally capable of, just so that way that one instance they can bail them out and keep the team in it. Like, a game where it's 4-3 for the Islanders is vastly different than 5-3, right? So when we're thinking about this in this game, I think if Tristan Jarry gave them a few more saves, it would have really been able to benefit the Penguins. But, I mean, like you said, how many goals was it? 10, 11, 12? High glove?
At least 10 high glove.
High glove, like, that's bad. For those of you who may not know, like, the blocker is a little bit bigger in size to the glove. Like, the glove is a little bit smaller, so a lot of forwards take advantage of that and they try and shoot glove side. But, you know, if you're an NHL goalie and you understand that your high glove is a weakness, that needs to be corrected. And unfortunately, this year it wasn't.
For sure, and now the Penguins have an entire off-season to not only do the post-mortem, rather, on this playoff loss, but also to look ahead to the future, because it really seems like the window at this point for them is closed. And why do I say that? Well, Pittsburgh's last Stanley Cup win was 2017. They also won one in 2016 before that, and that was obviously a combination of good development of guys like Jake Gensel, as well as building the right team and selling out to try to get over the hump and win some more Stanley Cups, which is great for them and that fan base. But the Pittsburgh Penguins have played in 5 playoff series since 2017, and they've only won one of them. And it just goes to show you, first of all, not just how demanding playoff hockey can be on the same group of guys if they're making the playoffs year in and year out, because if you think about it, that's several weeks more hockey that you're playing compared to guys that don't make the playoffs and have a longer off season. But at this point, it's yet another first round exit rather for the Penguins. Crosby, Malkin, and Letang are not getting any younger, and it kind of looks like it may not be immediate, but it looks like the window is closed for them.
Yeah, it's always hard to say like when the window is closed for a team when you have a player like Sidney Crosby, or you have Evgeny Malkin and you have Chris Letang, right? And like when you look at their team, they are older. Like Malkin is 34, Crosby 33. But then they also have Jason Zucker, who's 29, Brandon Tanev, who's 29,
Jeff Carter, who's 35.
36.
36, my apologies.
Brian Rust is 29 as well, and Chris Letang is 34, Brian Dumoulin is 29. Like, most of their players are getting up there in age. They're not in their prime anymore. And with Brian Burke going to, their hockey, VP of Hockey Operations, and Ron Hextall, their new general manager that they hired mid-season this year, both of them made the public statement that they are going to try and keep this window open. They're not going into a rebuild.
Right.
So what they're going to have to try and do is they're going to have to try and get players through free agency and trades that are younger than these guys that can maybe take some of the pressure off of Crosby and Malkin.
Yes, and it certainly remains to be seen whether or not they can do that. Mm-hmm. And I think that it'll be interesting what happens to the Penguins over the next few years, whether they are able to keep the window open, mm-hmm. or whether the attempt to do so simply sets that rebuild even further behind, because we have also seen that time and again with multiple teams mm-hmm. across multiple different sports. But last thing on the goalie subject before we move on, Tyson, I wanted to ask you this, is that, mm-hmm. like you said, not only is goaltending important in the playoffs, but you do need goalies to bail you out from time to time so that you can stay in a close game or try to mount a comeback that otherwise would be a little bit too far out of reach. Mm-hmm. The obvious counter argument to that is it depends on the quality of chances that you're facing, right? If you are letting in soft goals, or if you are letting in goals that you saw coming and wasn't able to shut the door on, I think in those situations you can rightfully criticize the goaltender for poor or inconsistent play. But what happens in a situation, not just to the team, but also to the goaltender's mind, if you let in 4 or 5 goals a game and all 5 of them were one-timers from star players, or deflections, or even breakaways from guys that know how to score? What, in your opinion, is the way to actually look at that? Because you're like, mm-hmm. okay, this goalie let in 5 goals and his team lost 5-2. That's not good. Yeah. But at the same time, who can reasonably be expected to stop these types of scoring chances?
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think you have to contextualize it. And I think a good way of thinking about it is like the 80s Oilers with Grant Fuhr. So Grant Fuhr, when you look at his numbers are bad. Like, he 3.5, 4 goals a game most of the time in the 80s. Like, I get it. It was the 80s. Tons of people, lots of goals. Lots of people were scoring out of their mind in the 80s.
Yes.
But with the Oilers, especially because they had, Gretzky, Messier, Curry, and Coffey, who's an offensive defenseman, they wanted to kind of outscore the other team a lot of nights. So they would win games 7-6 or 8-6 or that kind of game.
When the NHL ran lacrosse games back in the 80s.
Right, back in the 80s. So kind of when you look at it from the body of work of Grant Fuhr, you go, okay, you've done what you can up until this point, but the reason why Grant Fuhr is in the Hall of Fame is because when it gets to the third period and the game is close, he would make outstanding saves that he wouldn't have made in the first and second periods. And that is what the difference was between the Oilers winning cups and the Oilers not winning cups in the 80s. And that's kind of when I think about it in the context of it, is that in the third period especially, but also, during the game, like, if you're able to keep the game close, that I think is important. Not allowing the other team to get multiple goals ahead or kind of letting the game get out of hand. So when we think about kind of goaltending in that kind of sense, I think it's important to keep it contextualized. Like, obviously, if you're getting 10 breakaways a period, you're not going to have a good goals against or save percentage, and it's unreasonable to expect that. And I think in that situation, the defense would be criticized, but with like close games especially, like if you're down 2-1 or if you're down 3-2, you're trying to kind of keep your guys in the game. You got to make that exceptional save that helps keep your team in it. Like, there have been times with the Leaf series, and we can get into this a little bit later on, where the Leafs are up, but Carey Price makes an absolutely outstanding save and it keeps it at a 1-goal game. That kind of keeps the Canadians in it, and that is kind of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, and I think sometimes in the world of professional sports, it's just all too easy to criticize one player in a team sport, and but I think that most fair coaches, most fair analysts would do what you said, is contextualize the situation, and if a goalie gave up 5 A1 deflections, well, gee whiz, the guys in front of them need to get their sticks in those passing lanes and make sure that at least some of those deflection plays or backdoor plays never have a chance to develop, and that's a different situation than if your goalie gets smoked high glove by a third liner off the rush.
Yeah.
Right. So, with that said, why don't we move on to the Leafs-Habs series, just because you brought it up? Toronto's up 3-1, and you obviously love that fact.
Absolutely.
Not only are you on the cusp of victory, but it's over your most hated. Well, I don't know. Boston's pretty vilified. It's one of your two most hated rivals ever, and of course the Montreal-Toronto blood feud will always be something that gets the blood pressure of hockey fans up, particularly when it comes in the playoffs. But as we know, it certainly did not start according to plan for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And folks, for those of you that didn't see this play, John Tavares, who is a top 3 player on the Maple Leafs and one of the best centers in the league, was body checked. Was it the first or the second period?
First period.
It was the first period of Game 1, Leafs and Canadiens. He was body checked, which was a clean hit, and he fell to the ice, which is fairly normal, fairly routine play. What was not routine was the fact that Habs winger Corey Perry was skating in the vicinity, his eyes looking up ice to follow the play, and as John Tavares fell into his path, Perry was not able to evade in time, and he essentially kneed John Tavares straight in the face, and Tavares was down for several minutes and had to be stretchered off and taken to a local hospital. Very, very scary play, and very unfortunate that it happens to one of the top offensive players, certainly in Canada. But why don't you give us not only your feelings about that and how your heart probably stopped, but also how John Tavares is doing now, because I think it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, it definitely could have. And like there are a lot of people that understand like Corey Perry as a player. He's not necessarily the most sportsmanlike, if I could put it that way.
Correct.
There are a lot of people, and you as a Flames fan would know that Corey Perry has had a history of kind of towing the line between being dirty and being, fair. And I don't think that's one of these plays.
No,
this was a complete accident. And anybody who says that Corey Perry did this on purpose, trying to knee him in the head, is clearly wrong. Like Corey Perry and John Tavares, they're good friends. They've been on Olympic teams together. They've played on Team Canada.
And not only that, but at game speed, it is impossible to draw that up. You can't.
And it's just a total complete fluke accident. Now, Ben Sherratt, the guy who hit Tavares, he kind of led with his knee a little bit and kind of got half of Tavares.
Oh, okay.
Which kind of made it wasn't a dirty play because it happens all the time. But that's kind of how you're taught to hit, is kind of like lean forward and kind of lean towards him. And when you're trying to lean towards the players, naturally your feet and knees follow. So that's kind of Ben Sherratt is just doing what he was taught. So kind of that, and he kind of got half of Tavares and knocked him down and spun him around, and then unfortunately the collision with Corey Perry happened, and then the unfortunate sight of John Tavares half conscious trying to get up onto his own power and him unable to, and essentially falling backwards, was unfortunate to say the least, and it was very scary for everybody watching him. And I'll give the medical professionals credit. They did everything they could in that situation. Like John Tavares, half conscious, is trying to get up, and he clearly wasn't in the state to do so. So it definitely was very scary at the time, and it was very concerning. And I know a lot of Leaf players were very devastated once that happened. Like, for example, you saw Austin Matthews after that. He was in tears on the bench.
He absolutely was.
He was in tears on the bench. All of the guys who weren't on the bench came over and they had a knee down, and they were like, hoping that he would be okay.
Yes.
And it's always scary when...
And you have to give credit to Jumbo Joe Thornton and Jason Spezza for, I think, being calm veterans in that situation, trying to keep their teammates sort of at least under control as well.
Yeah, and I think, like, because the Leafs are a very young team, people forget, because the Jason Spezza, Joe Thornton, you know, Nick Foligno, Jake Muzzin, these are kind of like the veteran players on their team, but a lot of their team is very young. Like, Pierre Engvall is very young. He wasn't playing in that game, but Alex Kerfoot, you know, he's a young guy in his mid-20s, and Austin Matthews is still only
23. Marner.
You know, these guys are not, they're young players, so they haven't kind of gone through this serious injury that maybe other guys like Joe Thornton have. So, yeah, like, it was definitely scary and sad to say the least, and with the fight that came afterwards on Nick Foligno and Corey Perry, I don't know, like, people, like, disliked the fight, and I kind of go, well, what else are you supposed to do? I think it was kind of Nick Foligno's way of trying to get Toronto back into playing hockey mode, rather than trying to kind of do retribution for what Perry did to Thornton. I don't think that's what it was.
No, I don't think it was at all. He didn't jump him. He challenged him to a fight face to face. There was a conversation about it before, and Perry decided, let's just get this over with. And I think that, again, fighting is a controversial issue in hockey. That's a conversation for another time. But I do think, at least from an outsider's point of view, it seemed like Nick Foligno was trying to get closure for his team more than anything else. He was trying to get that out of the way so that they can try to win that game. So I would agree with you. Obviously, the Leafs were not able to win that game. It was a close one, and the Canadiens pulled it out 2-1. And then the Leafs came back with a 5-1 victory in Game 2. They ground out another close one, 2-1, Game 3, and then it was a 4-0 shutout in Game 4. So I want to ask you, as a Leafs fan, one game away from putting away Montreal, do you think it's a positive sign that your team has been able to win games not only in the absence of John Tavares, but that you've also been able to win games in multiple ways this series?
Oh, it's very, very very positive. I'm super thrilled about it. Like, William Nylander, for example, has 4 goals, and the Canadiens have 4 goals. So, like, the fact that the Canadiens only have 4 goals, I think it's something that the Canadiens are definitely going to have to try and fix this season in the off season, is trying to get more scoring. But with the Leafs, I think that also shows, like, how much they've improved defensively. Like, TJ Brody, he's been very good defensively for us.
Like we said a few months ago, I still find it fascinating that he's played much more of a defensive role than he did in Calgary.
Yeah, like, I mean, I'm watching in the playoffs, and Sheldon Keefe has Zach Bogosian and TJ Brody out there for the final 3 minutes of 1-goal games. Like, that's and like
impressive.
They also have, like, they have Muzzin and Hall. That's kind of their 4 guys that they want to use late game when killing, like, or when they have a lead. And, you know, Morgan Riley will also play a few minutes in those final 3 minutes or so. But that's kind of like their mainstay shutdown line. And TJ Brody and Zach Bogosian both have been exceptional defensively and helped shutting down the team and helped shutting down the Habs. So it's been good to see, you know, the scoring touch of William Nylander outside of John Tavares. It's good to see other guys step up. You know, Alex Galchenyuk had a 3-point night. That's always great to see. And also, yeah, the defense has been exceptional.
It always impresses me how depth guys can either, I don't know what it is. Sometimes I think it's depth guys elevating their game. Sometimes it's depth guys taking advantage of the opportunities that the playoffs provide for them. But let's be real. I mean, Justin Hall, I think on paper is a depth depth defenseman, or at least he kind of had that reputation earlier in his career. Zach Bogosian is this measurables king, but injuries, due to in large part, he never really lived up to his advanced potential, and he was, shall we say, not one of the primary defenders that Tampa Bay used during their cup run last year. And TJ Brody, at least in my experience in Calgary, was more of a two-way offensively oriented defensemen. So it's just cool to see that those guys are able to, I think particularly in the case of someone like Bogosian, to really step up and be like, you need me to shut down the opponent in the final minutes of the game. I'm able to do that for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's been really good. Now, Mitch Marner and Austin Matthews and Zach Hyman, that first line, they haven't really gotten on the score sheet a whole lot. Matthews, I think, has a goal, but other than kind of, the here and there offense, they've kind of been shut down. So that's something that I would like to hopefully see get better at, as hopefully the Leafs get better on in the playoffs. So
sure.
And I think that right now it's nothing to. We're not expecting them to all of a sudden go for 3 goals, but they could. You never know. They definitely have that skill. So, and I think they're skilled enough. They're going to get theirs. So.
Yeah, and you know what? One thing that I noticed in Game 1 for Austin Matthews in particular, we have talked earlier off the show about how Matthews appears to have matured significantly as a player and as a person compared to the years before. And I want to specifically point out what he did in Game 1, because even though he didn't score in that game, after John Tavares was taken to the hospital, I believe Austin Matthews finished that game with 8 shots on net. He was going for it. It was bombs away, and he was also using his size, doing everything he could to try to win that game, and Carey Price was just Carey Price that particular night. So I think sometimes it's not just about whether or not you score in the playoffs, but it is also whether you as a top player on your team are playing like it. And I feel that even though Matthews has not put up the big numbers yet, I think that he has been bringing it. He's been bringing the right attitude. He appears to be a tougher and more engaged player versus previous years. And he's a constant threat, which just gives Montreal something to worry about and opens up the ice for your other guys.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And it's good to see Austin Matthews not being, baited into taking penalties after the whistle. Like a lot of Canadians, they're trying to rough it up and they're trying to, grab on, players like Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner and try and get him into a pushing match or a fighting match. But it's good for Austin Matthews to stay disciplined and not go to the penalty box, take the power play. Now, the Leafs power play, they've been okay. They haven't been anything special. But the Leafs penalty kill has been exceptional. They've been 100% in this series.
Very good. That is definitely something that you're going to need in any team, any playoff series, because when you take a penalty, you give the other team the advantage, and that's not something you can have if you want to have consistently if you want to pull out that series. So, just for fun, before we move on to our next team, I'm gonna let you be Elliot Friedman here and say, what do the Maple Leafs need to do to close out the series? They can do it tonight, but even if they don't, what do they need to keep doing or start doing to close out the Habs?
What the Leafs need to do in order to close out the Habs is to continue to play stout defense. If the Canadians can't get 3 goals a game, I don't think they're going to win. I think I have more faith in the Leafs getting 3 than the Canadians getting 3. So with the Leafs, I think that the defensive ability is going to be key in order to help shut down the Canadians' offense, and then just let our boys run from there.
For sure, and we will see if they're able to do just that and book themselves a ticket in the second round. Now, having said that, we know that there are some teams that will not be booking their ticket to the second round already, and the Edmonton Oilers, unfortunately for them, fall into that category. I think very few people reasonably expected the Winnipeg Jets to sweep the Edmonton Oilers, which for all you non-hockey folks, that's 4 straight wins, the playoff series, which is all you need to move on. And the Winnipeg Jets, for most of those games, played very stout defense on Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, 2 top 5 offensive threats in the NHL. And the last 3 games, all went to overtime, and the final game, that Game 4, went to triple OT. I frankly did not stay up for that.
I did.
You did, and well, in that case, why don't we start there? What do you remember your first impressions being after Kyle Connor's triple OT winner and thinking about, wow, the Oilers just got swept by the Jets?
Yeah, I was a little bit stunned at the fact that they got swept. I thought Edmonton was going to pull out that game and go back to Edmonton and for Game 5. But, yeah, like, I saw it and I was like, okay, so what's happening here is that this is now a war of stamina and endurance. And the Winnipeg Jets have more depth. And I think that the team that has more depth definitely will have a beneficial chance. The longer the game goes on, the team that has the most depth plays that. And I think, like they said in the intermission between the second and third intermission, that the Winnipeg Jets, they played, I think, 11 forwards, and the Oilers only played 9. So when you're kind of handicapped in a way of like, okay, we need to score, we need to be on our best, and we're only going to play, we're only going to roll 3 lines, that's really tough on those three lines for 3 overtime periods. So it gives a lot of understanding on where the Oilers' weaknesses were in that series, is that it was their depth. Because, I saw Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, and he was mostly inefficient for most of that game. Like, he got a goal that game, but it was kind of off of a lucky bounce where he split the defense, kind of got in alone, and was able to kind of put it high on Hellebuck. But realistically, Nugent-Hopkins, that second line, that third line, they weren't offensive threats. So then the entire offense was relying on McDavid and Draisaitl.
Right, and top heaviness is rarely a formula for success in the NHL. In the NHL playoffs, and much to your point about defense, pardon me, Darnell Nurse played a 4 minute 47-second shift in overtime in that Game 4, which is absolutely unheard of, and it honestly, props to him that he was still a living, breathing man at the end of that shift, because that's extreme. But at the same time, like you were alluding to before, if you have to ride the same guys that heavily because you don't have enough depth, or you don't trust your bottom pair guys to play a few more minutes, that certainly does not bode well.
No, it doesn't. And I think going into the series, everybody saw like how the Winnipeg Jets were reeling going into the playoffs, and like no doubt they did not have good games. Like their last 10 games, they lost the vast majority going into the playoffs, and the Oilers looked amazing going into the playoffs. So naturally, a lot of people took the Oilers because they were like, oh yeah, their depth players are just going to be enough, and McDavid and Draisaitl are just going to go bananas. But unfortunately, what happened is that the Winnipeg Jets defense and the depth players were able to shut down McDavid and Draisaitl by what I would consider cheating, because they were doing interference, they were hooking him, they were holding him, but the refs weren't calling it because it's the playoffs.
So essentially a throwback to the clutch and grab era.
Yeah, and for example, like McDavid drew a total of 0 penalties in that entire series. Like that's not how it's supposed to go. Like I think that if the refs called the game according to the rule books, the Oilers definitely would have had more power plays, and I think they would have scored more. And I think with the Jets defense being able to run into McDavid, interfere with him, hold him, kind of cause him to get into scrums along this outside of the play or whatever, it helped benefit the Jets defense. And ultimately McDavid, he's not good enough to fight through the refs and the Winnipeg defense.
Oh, really? I thought he was the savior. No, I'm just kidding. He's a phenomenal player, but like you said, this is a team sport, and you can only do so much as a superstar to elevate your team. And one thing that I also wanted to bring up is not just the lack of depth on the back end for the Edmonton Oilers. For example, Ethan Bear was, I believe, benched in Game 4 after just a brutal turnover in his own end, throwing the puck up the middle, and it being picked off by a Jet and leading to a goal. But also in the forward core, you mentioned Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and how he was largely inefficient. Then you have two guys like Dominic Cahoon and Kyler Yamamoto, two guys that, while undersized, they have skill on paper. And you would think that playing with McDavid and Draisaitl, that both those guys could have hit at the bare minimum 10 goals, if not 20 plus. And neither of them hit 10 goals. And I think that really just shows you how top-heavy the Oilers are.
Yeah. Everybody was upset with Ken Holland at the trade deadline when he said you can't go all in every year. And everybody was like, what do you mean? You have McDavid, you have Draisaitl, it's the North Division, it's a weaker division. This is your best chance to get through. And I think now, in hindsight, Ken Holland was right. They didn't have enough. And the guys that they had on their team, like Yamamoto and Dominic Cahoon, they should have been better than they were this year. And like you said, like I was surprised at how bad Yamamoto was in the last half of the season. Like, he's a good player, and he's feisty, and he tries, and he has excellent effort every night. And for a lot of time, you couldn't say that about most Oilers. So he gives it, he has effort, and he's definitely a really good core player of their future. But he didn't produce this year. And with playing with Draisaitl and sometimes McDavid, he needs to produce more, especially also being on that power play at times as well. So I think that when you look at the Oilers, it just shows you like they are not one or two players away. There are multiple players away on offense and on defense, and possibly a goaltender, because Mike Smith, he's 39,
yes,
turning 40. Mikko Koskinen was pretty underwhelming this year. He didn't play very well. So the Oilers are multiple pieces away from competing for a Stanley Cup, and I think that this sweep kind of wakes up Oilers fans to realize that.
Yes, and I think that another thing that is worth touching on is the ultimately series-changing penalty that Josh Archibald took in the third period of Game 3. This is a game where, after being essentially smothered with a pillow in Games 1 and 2, McDavid and Draisaitl hit it hard out of the gates, and they were scoring goals, setting up their line mates. The Oilers were, I believe it was a 3-1 lead. It might have been a 4-1 lead. Actually, I think it was a 4-1 lead in the third period of that Game 3. And Josh Archibald, who's one of their bottom six forwards, he goes ahead and he hits Logan Stanley, the Jets defenseman, low, clips him in the knees. He takes a penalty. The Jets score on that power play, and they score two more in the next 3 minutes to tie that game before ultimately winning it in overtime. I think that was by far the Oilers' best chance to get back into that series. They needed to hold a 3-goal lead for about 12 minutes, and they weren't able to do so. And when we look at not just how bad the timing was on Josh Archibald's penalty, but also what it was, you really think that fired up the Jets and got them emotionally invested in the game again, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, like, for the Winnipeg Jets, Nikolai Ehlers came back that game. So, like, Nikolai Ehlers, he had scored earlier in the game, and I believe he also got the game winner that game. So he had a very good night, and the Jets absolutely missed Nikolai Ehlers for the back half of the year when he was hurt. So I think, like...
He's a straw that stirs the drink, kind of like Kyle Lowry is for the Toronto Raptors.
Yeah, kind of, yeah, exactly like that. So definitely the Jets benefited from getting Ehlers and Pierre-Luc Dubois back in the lineup after missing them for the back half of the regular season. But like you said, like, there's no excuse for taking that penalty. It's just a dumb move by Archibald to try and go low at that point in the game. Like, the last thing you want to do when you're beating a team handily at that point, 3 goals I would say is quite handily, the last thing you want to do is get them emotionally invested in the game again, because kind of when you score a goal, it kind of knocks the wind out of you a little bit. But when you score multiple goals, it's like, oh, now we have to fight through this. It's hard to get your mind and your emotions back in this game. But when Josh Archibald tries to go low on Logan Stanley, a lot of Jets players took that as dirty, which it was, and he got suspended for it. But that got the Jets emotionally invested back into that game, and kind of like what we said about Tristan Jarry, letting in 3 goals. Mike Smith, he needs to make a save there. I didn't love the Josh Morrissey tying goal. That, point shot, went 5-hole,
Sure.
not really screened. I didn't love that one. I thought that, that was definitely a soft goal. And at the same time, like, Mike Smith, you need to be able to kind of backstop the Oilers when they're reeling, especially because you know that the Oilers' defense isn't as deep as the Jets is, I think.
And you know what the Archibald penalty reminds me of, albeit to a lesser extent, was the 2019 playoffs, I believe, the Vegas Golden Knights and the San Jose Sharks. And Vegas had a 4-0 lead in the third period of Game 7. Like you said, they were handily beating the San Jose Sharks and on their way to the next round of the playoffs. And then Cody Eakin cross-checks former Sharks captain Joe Pavelski in the face, off a face-off. It was an incredibly needless play, and because Pavelski was coming off a facial injury at that point, there was a lot of blood. He was badly messed up and had to leave the game. Cody Eakin was thrown out, and San Jose...
It was a 5-minute major.
Yes.
Yes, and was he thrown out? I can't remember.
I believe he was, but nonetheless, the point I was trying to make is that San Jose stormed back with 4 power play goals in the third period en route to an eventual 5-4 overtime series winner. And I think that the Archibald play and the Eakin play, like the Archibald play, not nearly as severe, but still they're cut from the same cloth of you are handily beating your opponent and you did something that put yourself behind the 8 ball because it was a power play to the other team, but you also fired up every single person on the opposing bench and they made you pay for it.
Absolutely. And I think with the Oilers, I think that that's a learning experience. Josh Archibald, he's a good penalty killer, he's a good depth guy, but, don't know if he's had much playoff experience, so I think that's something that the Oilers will have to learn from, and it's tough right now and it's a tough pill to swallow, especially because they got swept. So,
and we will see what transpires in the second round of the NHL playoffs. The Wild and Golden Knights and the Predators and the Hurricanes, as of Thursday morning, they have got a couple of Game 7s, I believe, upcoming. Those
Game 6 for Carolina.
Game 6 for Carolina, my mistake, and Game 7 for Wild and the Golden Knights, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out. So with all that said, why don't we move on to the other major North American sport that is in the playoffs right now. That, of course, is basketball with the NBA. But before we talk about the playoffs specifically, let's talk about one of the most polarizing players in the NBA, Russell Westbrook, who earlier this year set the record for the most triple-doubles in NBA history with 184 of them. Second place goes to Oscar Robertson with 181 over the course of his career many years ago. Now, again, if you don't know what a triple-double is, it is essentially when a player scores in double digits in 3 categories, which is almost always, I almost said goals, it's not hockey,
no.
Points, assists, and rebounds. And
sometimes it can be steals.
Sometimes it can be.
Or blocks if you're Joakim Noah.
If you're a freak.
Yeah.
But anyways, Russell Westbrook is an extremely athletic player, tons of talent. He tries almost harder than anyone I've ever seen. And he sure rebounds scarily well for a 6'3" point guard, at least on paper. And again, on paper, this is a very, very impressive feat. But Tyson, you're not particularly impressed by Russell Westbrook in spite of the numbers he's putting up on paper. Why is that?
I don't understand why people love Russell Westbrook. Sorry, I think Westbrook is so overrated. Like, it's so easy for a really good basketball player to get points and assists and rebounds on a bad basketball team, and I think that that's what Westbrook has made a career of doing. Is that he's a stat monger, he's a ball hog, and he's really good on bad teams. I think that's kind of what he does. For me personally, I value a triple-double on a good team that is in a playoff spot way more than a triple-double that is on a 10th, 11th place team, which is what Washington was for most of the year. And I don't think that Russell Westbrook is particularly good at contributing to team wins. I think he's more focused on his own stats. And like Westbrook, I'll give him this. He tries incredibly hard. And nobody goes for rebounds and points than Russell Westbrook. But he doesn't shoot the ball very well. He's a high usage player. He oftentimes has a lot of turnovers. Russell Westbrook ultimately it's inefficient basketball. And I don't think that it contributes to winning. So I think that when you're looking at stats and you're looking at player individual achievements, you have to contextualize his numbers with his team wins. Because the year that Russell Westbrook had averaged a triple-double, Oklahoma City was the 7th seed in the West and was out in the first round. Like, I don't think that Westbrook, as the main focus of any NBA team, can be a quality franchise that can make noise in the playoffs, let alone ever win a championship. So I think that, but the problem is that Westbrook, because of the way that he plays, has to be the focus of how you play, because he's so ball dominant. So I don't think that any team that Russell Westbrook leads can ever have success, and the problem is that Russell Westbrook won't ever be in a position to not being a leader, because he doesn't know how to play without the basketball.
And that might be fighting words, shall we say, to a lot of people, but I think that you're closer to the truth than what some people would give you credit for. And to back that up, we want to give a shout out to a YouTuber that goes by the username JXMY High Roller, Jimmy High Roller,
I guess.
because at the end of March, he put out a video called 15 Facts About the NBA That May Just Blow Your Mind. And the one that I'm about to share, not only is it pertinent to the Westbrook debate, but it's just, it will blow your mind. And so we thank you, Mr. High Roller, for digging up this gem and sharing it with the general community on YouTube. But this really comes down to not just the idea of points scored or raw numbers on a stat sheet, but it is points generated, which is a combination of the points that a player personally scored and the points that the player makes possible by making assists. It's those two things put together, right? Because obviously if you assisted on a basket, you were involved in the generation of those points. And Russell Westbrook, despite, like, Russell Westbrook is in his mid-30s. He's no spring chicken, right, anymore. He's in the back half of his career. He is 32 years of age, but even so, with that said in mind, all of those triple-doubles, the 184 triple-doubles he's had, has led to a total of 38,820 points generated. Now that's pretty darn good. It's better than James Harden. It's better than Shaquille O'Neal. It's better than Kevin Garnett. It's very close to Dirk Nowitzki, some all-time great players. And so, like you said, Westbrook's a talented player. He tries very hard, and he put up the numbers. But I think that if you want to call him overrated, which is, I feel like that word's bandied about a little bit too much in the sports world, but nonetheless, if you want to actually look at the facts here, first of all, I want to bring in a couple other players. First one's Chris Paul, who is a great point guard in his own right, much more of a traditional point guard than an athlete who wants to be a center at 6'3" in the NBA.
Right.
Chris Paul is, I believe, 35, 36 years old. So he's not done yet, but he's also in the twilight of his career. And Chris Paul has generated 42,542 points compared to 38,820 for Westbrook. Now, Paul has played a few more years, true, but when you also keep in mind that Westbrook holds the all-time record for triple-doubles, Chris Paul does not even come close to that.
No.
And Chris Paul has generated roughly 4,000 more points without needing to pad the stat sheet like that.
Yeah.
That is very, very revealing, is it not?
I believe so, and like it just shows you, like, Chris Paul as a playmaker is able to pass the ball and help create points. more efficiently and more effectively than Westbrook is. And we all know that Westbrook is much more of a scorer than Chris Paul is. So, like, that definitely helped benefit Westbrook in this situation, because if you're scoring more points, that means you're generating more points. So, obviously, that helps play into the stat a little bit. But with Chris Paul not being able to score at the level that Westbrook is, while still being able to generate more points overall than he was, I think shows you how efficient and effective Chris Paul can be on a good team compared to what Westbrook has to be on any team.
And just to put a nice pretty bow on this particular point, there's another player that you might have heard of out there that is relevant in this conversation. His name's LeBron James.
Mm-hmm.
And get ready for this. Love him or hate him, like, I understand he's a polarizing player. He has been to 10 finals and lost 6 of them. Maybe he flops too much, blah, blah, blah. We're not here to talk about any of those things right now. But LeBron James has generated 56,682 points, which is 4,000 plus ahead of second place John Stockton in the 52,900 range, and leagues ahead of anyone else that has ever played in the NBA. LeBron James has only 99 triple doubles, air quote 99, only 99 triple doubles. And again, he's also played more years than Westbrook, but I don't think these numbers in this case lie. The discrepancy is just too extreme, and LeBron James has proven to be freakishly good at helping his basketball team score points, whereas Westbrook is, despite holding that triple-double record, is significantly less good at that.
I would make that argument, and for me personally, like, you could double Westbrook's career, and he still wouldn't be close, right? Like Westbrook's points generated, double it, and you're at, what, 4,500 if that? So you're still well off of what LeBron has already. So I don't think that Westbrook plays winning basketball, and I think, like, that's not necessarily Westbrook's fault in the fact that he was always playing this way and that's how he was taught to play. But man, I think that he's a special player that has absolutely no value when it comes to winning championships. And I personally value championships more than individual accomplishments. And, like, I personally think that I would take a player that can help me win a championship over a superstar any day. And I don't want Westbrook on my basketball team because I don't think he can help contribute to winning.
You know what? I think that's a fair argument given some of the numbers here. Now, for me personally, the jury's still out a little bit on Westbrook. I'll admit I like measurables and stats just because they're fun, just because it's fun to watch guys put up big numbers and you go like, wow, how did he do that? But it's equally true that Westbrook has never won a championship, and he has never really helped his team get particularly close to an NBA Finals. And so I just think that,
I mean, he was with Oklahoma City, but that team had Durant leading it. It also had Serge Ibaka and James Harden off the bench. Westbrook was often considered to be like the second best player in Oklahoma City, but the way that he played the game of basketball, it wasn't conducive to winning. Honestly, I don't think that if that team stayed the way it was, with Westbrook leading the charge, that team would have won a championship. I'm not sure if they could have. Maybe Kevin Durant and James Harden and Ibaka and Westbrook could have figured it out, but not the way that Westbrook plays basketball right now.
And once again, the Washington Wizards find themselves in deep in the playoffs. Their last outing was a 120-95 loss to the Philadelphia 76ers, and certainly didn't help that Westbrook rolled his ankle in the first game of that series, but it looks like once again that Westbrook is going to finish a spectacular statistical season with, shall we say, not getting particularly close to an NBA final.
Underwhelming playoff.
Underwhelming
playoff performances, and I think that's kind of his career, is that he'll always be a statistician's dream in the regular season. and then in the playoffs he won't be able to do much.
Now, speaking of underwhelming playoff performances in the basketball world, Exhibit A, the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, for those of you that need a memory jog here, the LA Clippers surrendered double-digit leads in games 5, 6, and 7 of the 2020 Western Conference semifinals last year, and they lost the Denver Nuggets after going up 3-1 in that series in one writer from The Athletic put it best, arguably the worst 5-day stretch in the history of the franchise. It was painful, and I am not a Clippers fan, but I could only imagine the angst that fan base probably felt over that week. And certainly all eyes were on them going into this season. Is Paul George going to be able to overcome pandemic Paul George, which we were treated to last year? Is Kawhi Leonard going to be good enough? And more importantly, is the team going to be good enough as a unit to meet the lofty expectations placed upon them? So earlier this week, and this Tuesday, the Clippers, who finished as the 4 seed in their conference, faced the number 5 Dallas Mavericks in Game 2 of their first round matchup this year, with a fan base very hungry for redemption, to say the least. LA lost the first game 113-103, and they had another shot at the Mavericks on home court to boot to even things up. And Kawhi Leonard was Kawhi Leonard with 41 points, shooting 14 of 21 from the field, 6 rebounds, 4 assists, and 2 steals. Paul George was anything but pandemic P. He had 28 points and 12 rebounds for a very solid double-double, and he shot 12 of 22 from the field. And guess what, Tyson? The Clippers lost 127-121. And what ended up happening in that game is that Dallas went on a 24-10 run in the third quarter. Kawhi and Paul George were lighting it up in the first half. Kawhi had 30, Paul George had 17 in the first half, and it had mounted, first of all, to just a 2-point lead going into halftime, which is fairly worrying if both your stars are going off like that. Anyways, 24-10 run in the third quarter over about 8.5 minutes, and that was a lead that they never gave up over the course of that night. And yes, the Dallas Mavericks have a young superstar named Luka Doncic, who put up 39 points, 7 rebounds, and 7 assists that game. But his team also made a total of 18 three-pointers in that game, 17 in Game 1. But Tyson, I think worst of all for the Clippers is the fact that over the first 2 games this series, they have repeatedly failed to play solid defense. They've allowed Dallas players to cut past them for uncontested dunks and drives and layups on a regular basis. On many occasions, if you look back on the game tape, Clipper players have seemed confused and unable to keep up with their rotations as their opponents routinely abuse them for easy and seemingly preventable baskets. Now, for a team that's the oldest team in the league age-wise, and a team for which all of the newcomers they've added this year have at least a decade of NBA experience, this is inexcusable, frankly.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, 121 points for the Clippers should be good enough to win playoff games, because oftentimes they boast that they have the 2 best wing guard defenders in the NBA in Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. But yet Luka
and Patrick Beverley, who should be a very good 3-and-D point as well.
First team all defense, right? So what's going wrong for the Clippers? They just simply can't guard Luka. And that's what's going on, and that's the problem, is that Luka is going off. He's hitting from 3. He's hitting better from 3 than he did in the regular season, which is not something that the Clippers probably expected to happen. And Luka's still able to drive the basketball, get into where he needs to go to score good buckets. He's able to dish to Porzingis in tight, in deep, for those buckets down low. And
Tim Hardaway, who is lighting it up from downtown as well.
Exactly, and that's what happens when you have Luka, who can't get, even with Kawhi or Paul George guarding him, he's too good that they need to double him, because Kawhi can't handle Luka because he's just so much of an offensive threat. So that leaves guys like Tim Hardaway Jr. he's left open, and now he can take open threes. The vast majority of the Mavericks threes that are being taken are open or uncontested threes. So when you have a ton of open and uncontested shots, the expectation is that you're going to hit most of them. So with Luka Doncic being able to be such effective scoring the basketball while also being able to generate points through Porzingis and through Tim Hardaway and through other guys on his team, it's leading the Clippers to have to deal with this mess offensively where they can't stop Luka, they have to double team him, and then other guys are hitting open shots.
And I think that's a good point, and to that I would add the fact that the Clippers cannot not be on the same page at this stage of the season. You have one opponent that you're going against, and like I said, this is an extremely seasoned, experienced team. A bunch of former all-defensive first-teamers, Leonard, George, Beverly, like we said, Serge Ibaka and Rajon Rondo as well, are former NBA champions who at some point have been on that all-defensive first team and all-defensive second team. And the fact that the Clippers starters have been outscored by 24 points in the first 2 games of the series, which so far has been decided by a 16-point spread, I think that as much as Luka Doncic is a superstar and as much as he is running the offense exceptionally well in Dallas right now, the other part of the problem is that for whatever reason, the LA Clippers don't seem to be in sync right now, and that there's just too much experience on this team. There's too much, at least, latent defensive ability on many of these players to be able to not just give things up, but give things up the way that they are giving up. And I can't help but think of how well documented it was after last year's collapse. Kawhi and Paul George getting preferential treatment, players disagreeing with each other, fighting with each other, with the coaching staff not handling these conflicts well. And if the Clippers are miscommunicating still in the first round of the playoffs, despite all this experience, it to me indicates potentially a level of dysfunction within the organization that perhaps has not yet been addressed to the extent that it should. And if that is even a little bit true, it makes Luka Doncic's job that much easier to drive the basketball and set up his teammates.
Absolutely, it really does, and that helps really with Porzingis as well, because Porzingis, he's kind of been a kind of an interesting player since he's gotten to Dallas. He was able to hit 20 points. He's gotten double-doubles this year. He's been able to hit from 3 in this series, which is always good to see. And yeah, I think that ultimately if the Clippers can't figure out a way to stop Luka or to get on the same page defensively, then they're going to find themselves out of this series real fast. And like the Clippers, they haven't even made the conference final in their existence. So this would be extremely disappointing. And like you mentioned last year with all the problems that were going on with the team, that was a huge reason why Doc Rivers was fired in the season. Now he's coaching Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia 76ers look right. But if this doesn't work out, what is the next move in the offseason for the Clippers? Like, if they don't come back from this series and win 2 games, 3 games, and force either a game 7 or game 6, like, what do you do? Like, I don't know how you're supposed to move this along and fix this. The Clippers, they don't have any draft picks because they gave them all up to get Paul George on their team. I don't see them getting any players free agency because they spent all their money on Kawhi and guys like Serge Ibaka and
George, of course,
and Paul George and Rajon Rondo. So, like, where are the Clippers going to be getting better from this iteration of the team? I don't know if it happens. This is kind of the best that they can be at this point. Ultimately, hopefully they can maybe do something in the offseason to maybe shake up the team. But if there's a core problem between chemistry-wise between Kawhi and Paul George and the rest of the team, I don't think they're going anywhere.
And I'll tell you what, I'm glad I don't have to answer those questions that you just posed, because the LA Clippers are not in a good spot right now, and Few teams have come back from down 2-0 to win a series in the NBA. None have ever come back from down 3-0. And so the Clippers are again facing an uphill battle. And if they're not able to win on Friday night that game 3, then in all likelihood they may lose the series, barring something extremely unexpected. And unless that Deus Ex Machina materializes to save them from whatever this is, like you said, there might be some even harder questions asked this offseason versus the last offseason, because clearly things are not working out the way that the head office expected when they put Kawhi Leonard together with Paul George. Now, with that being said, we also wanted to just talk a bit about the unusual playoff format that in the NBA this year, and that's the play-in tournament, where some of the bottom seeds in each conference needed to play each other. I believe it was, what was it, 7 through 10.
Yeah.
Right, they had to play one another for the right to fill out the eventual 7 and 8 seeds, I believe, in the playoffs. And this was a bit of a polarizing idea. LeBron said that whoever came up with it needs to be fired. But what do you think, Tyson? It's something the NBA's never done before.
So I think that this is okay, here's my personal opinion, okay, is that I want to keep the regular season games as meaningful as they possibly can be. And I'm going to use the MLB to give you an example of what not to do, and then I'm going to talk about the NBA. So the MLB, they have 30 teams, and in each division, they can only have 4 teams in the ALDS and NLDS, so the divisional round of the series. So what this effectively means is that they have 3 teams that make the playoffs in each conference, and then 2 teams that make the wild card. And then the 2 wild card teams play 1 game, and then that 1 game series goes into the ALDS. So effectively what happens is that the top 5 teams from each conference make the playoffs in the Major League Baseball. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I've always found that to be a bit odd, given how Major League Baseball plays 162 regular season games, only to have a playoff format that's shorter than basketball and hockey. Right,
so it's only 10 teams, and it's a 162 game regular season. So if by July you realize you're not a top 10 team in baseball, then essentially the rest of the regular season is about you preparing for next year. And that's something where I look at the Major League Baseball. I'm not sure if they've changed it, but this is how they used to be, at least. That only allowing 10 teams into the playoffs, and 4 of those teams get, to play each other in only 1 game. So 2 teams of the 10 are eliminated after 1 game. Like, that's so exclusive that essentially if you're not a top 10, top 8 team, you don't really have a chance in the playoffs for baseball. So a lot of times in the teams that aren't as good, there may be like the 15th or 12th best team. They're above average, but they're not a top 10 team, so they're not going to make the playoffs. That kind of leaves them in limbo. So I don't like that format. But also when you look at the NBA, it used to be top 8 from each conference makes the playoffs. So that's 16 out of 30 teams. That's more than half. And now that you have this play-in round, it effectively means that like 10 teams have a chance at making the playoffs in each conference. That's 20 out of 30 teams. That's 2/3 of the league can make the playoffs. And what we've seen in the NBA is that there are a lot of teams that like to do load management. The Raptors did this with Kawhi. The Lakers do this now with LeBron. If you have stars, you want to rest them sometimes, because you understand that it doesn't matter if you get 1, 2, 3, or 4th seed in the NBA playoffs. As long as you're in the playoffs, you got to beat who's ahead of you anyways. So even if the Lakers are the 7th seed, they're still the defending champs. They still have LeBron and AD, but they needed to rest them because they had injuries and they needed to have that time off. So what it effectively means is that the regular season becomes meaningless for the best teams, because they don't need to win every game.
Right.
They don't have to win every game. So whereas like the baseball doesn't have enough teams, and that makes the regular season meaningless, the base basketball now with the play-in round has too many teams that I think can make the playoffs, and that also makes the regular season meaningless. So this is where I come to you and I look at the NFL and the NHL models of playoffs, and I like that better because I think that it gives the most teams the maximum amount of regular season that matters, but also having, a good number of teams in the playoffs.
Now, granted, I still don't like the anomalous dynamic between NFL divisions that occasionally allows a team to make the playoffs without even going 500.
Yeah.
I think that's a conversation for another time, however. But for the most part, I would agree with you, especially given the fact that in the NBA, there is less parity than the NHL to boot.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the times, the 7 and 8 seeds, kind of like you said with Oklahoma City, is just one of many examples back in the day. They go out in the first round, they go out in the second round, and more often than not, it's those top teams, as long as they stay healthy, that are competing for the championship anyway. Whereas in the NHL, there seems to be at least more parity. So just like the 2012 LA Kings, you can have an 8th seed come in and not only win the playoffs, but dominate, and in a way that no one thought that they would have expected. Mm-hmm. So as much as it's great for all of these teams to make the playoffs, and regret to the Toronto Raptors for not even being able to make that lower bar this year, the Raptors have a lot of things to work on, obviously, in the future, but that aside...
The Tampa Raptors. This year didn't count for
Yes. Yeah, the Tampa Bay Raptors, who definitely did not get any of the mojo that the Tampa Bay Lightning have right now,
No, yeah.
But... Anyways, my point is that I think it was worth a try, but at the same time, I would agree with your arguments, at least in principle. And in addition to that, I would say that there doesn't appear to be enough parity in the NBA to warrant having all these extra teams in the playoffs, because the chances of these lower seeds making a deep run seem to be quite a bit rarer.
Yeah. And I mean, good for the Grizzlies, for example, for getting into the playoffs. And, they were the 9th seed, and they were able to beat Oklahoma City to get into the playoffs. And they actually beat Utah in round 1. So, good for the Grizzlies, good for them. And they got a good team there. They got JB, they got Ja Morant. They're looking very good, and they're looking very promising.
One more time, Jonas Valsu Inawasas.
Man, that's a bad pronunciation. But Jonas Valanciunas, good team, good players, but... I think it's a matter of time before they lose to Utah, because Utah's such a good team. But I don't necessarily like the play-in.
That's fair. And again, like I said, I think it was worth a try. But I think we can see what ends up happening in the future, and whether or not they go back to this, or whether they try to change it up somehow. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I personally don't have strong feelings for or against the play-in. But I do think that it doesn't seem to be an idea with a great deal of upside, given the overall situation of the NBA. Anyways, folks, that'll do it for us here today at the draft board. We hope you guys are staying safe and enjoying the embarrassment of riches as far as playoff sports that is going on right now, and we hope that we were able to be part of that conversation for y'all. So once again, for Tyson, I'm David, and we're signing off until next time from the draft board.
Thank you for listening to The Draft Board. Podcast music, intro, and outro is produced by Graham Besse. Your hosts, again, are David Song and Tyson Workington. Come back next week for more insight from the rink, the turf, and the court. See you soon.